Nothing breaks all at once. That's the lie that keeps people calm. They imagine crashes as explosions. One bad day, one bad headline, one sudden collapse. But history doesn't work like that. It never has. In 1929, the world didn't wake up poor. It drifted there. Markets were still rising. Newspapers were still optimistic. Ordinary people still believed the system had evolved beyond failure. Sound familiar? Back then, America was told it had entered a new era. Productivity was booming. Technology was transforming work. Credit made life easier. Risk felt manageable. People weren't reckless. They were confident. And confidence is far more dangerous than greed. Stocks didn't rise because everyone was speculating wildly. They rose because the system encouraged participation, easy credit, friendly brokers, deferred risk. You didn't need to be rich. You didn't need to be smart. You just needed to believe tomorrow would look like yesterday. That belief spread fast. Farmers borrowed to modernize. Workers borrowed to invest. Middle-class families put savings into markets they didn't fully understand, not because they were irresponsible, but because everyone else was doing it. And the system rewarded them. At first, prices climbed, paper wealth grew. Losses disappeared as long as money kept flowing forward. Warning signs were visible, but ignored. Why? Because the system punished caution. Those who stayed out looked foolish. Those who hesitated felt left behind. Risk wasn't framed as danger. It was framed as opportunity. That's always step one. Then came the subtle shift. Returns slowed, volatility increased, debt loads became heavier, but quietly. Nothing snapped, no alarms went off. People adjusted instead of exiting. That's step two. Margin requirements tightened. Interest costs rose. Liquidity thinned. But instead of asking why, people were told to stay calm, to hold, to trust the structure. After all, institutions said everything was under control. They always do. Here's the part most history lessons rush past. The crash didn't create the damage, it revealed it. By the time prices collapsed, the system was already fragile. Too much leverage, too many promises tied to future growth, too many people dependent on prices staying high, not just rising. When confidence cracked, everything connected to it cracked too. Banks didn't fail because of panic. Panic happened because banks were already exposed. Jobs didn't disappear overnight. They vanished as credit froze, demand collapsed, and obligations didn't shrink. And when it finally hit the real economy, it wasn't dramatic. It was suffocating. Savings erased. Wages cut. Opportunities narrowed. People didn't revolt. They adapted downward. That's the real legacy of 1929. Not the crash. The slow loss of options that followed. Now here's why this matters and why this video exists. Because the conditions that made 1929 possible weren't unique. They weren't tied to a single decade, technology, or market. They were structural. And those same structures don't announce themselves when they return. They hide inside progress. They disguise themselves as stability. They convince people that this time is smarter. And right now, once again, risk is framed as normal. Debt is framed as manageable. Exposure is framed as innovation. And warning signs are framed as noise. History doesn't repeat because people forget dates. It repeats because people repeat behavior. And the most dangerous moment is always the same. When everyone believes the system has learned from the past. That's when it stops listening. And that's exactly where we are again. Crashes don't start with selling. They start with incentives. In 1929, the system didn't push people off a cliff. It built a smooth road that only went forward. Every rule, every signal, every reward pointed in one direction. Stay in, leverage more, don't question momentum. The dangerous part wasn't speculation. It was normalization. Borrowing wasn't framed as risk. It was framed as efficiency. Margin wasn't a gamble. It was access. Credit didn't feel like debt. It felt like participation. And once that mindset spreads, the system stops needing enforcement. People police themselves. If someone warned about excess, they sounded outdated. If someone stepped back, they felt irrelevant. The cost of caution became social, not financial. That's how bubbles become stable. Not because they're safe, but because exiting feels unsafe. Behind the scenes, something else was happening. Institutions weren't just lending money. They were chaining future promises together. Loans depended on asset prices. Asset prices depended on confidence. Confidence depended on continuous participation. Remove any one piece and the structure weakens. But here's the trick. The system doesn't collapse when it weakens. It collapses when it can't roll forward anymore. In 1929, this happened quietly at first. Credit tightened slightly. Terms changed. Costs rose just enough to matter, but not enough to alarm. People didn't panic. They adapted. That adaptation is fatal, because adaptation usually means taking on more risk to maintain the same outcome. Borrow a little extra. Stretch timelines. Assume next quarter fixes everything. That's how fragility compounds invisibly. By the time selling began, it wasn't fear driving it. It was math. Margins had limits. Payments had deadlines. Liquidity had edges. When prices dipped, leverage didn't forgive. It demanded. And once forced selling started, confidence didn't collapse. It reversed. Every buyer became cautious. Every lender became selective. Every promise was suddenly questioned. The system flipped its incentives. Participation was no longer rewarded. Exit was. And that's when the damage spread outward. Markets froze first, then credit, then wages, then jobs. Not because people lost faith, because the structure stopped moving. Now look carefully at what matters here. Not the era, not the assets, not the names. The pattern. A system that grows by pulling future value forward always reaches the same point. It becomes dependent on continuation. The moment continuation slows, everything tightens at once. That's not bad management. That's design. Because systems built on leverage don't break loudly at first. They constrict. They narrow options. They turn flexibility into obligation. And people don't feel trapped until movement stops. This is why early warnings always sound wrong. As long as prices hold, critics look foolish. As long as liquidity flows, risk looks contained. As long as participation continues, stability feels earned. But stability built on forward dependency isn't stability. It's balance on momentum. And momentum doesn't need bad news to stop. It only needs hesitation. That's the real warning of 1929. Not that markets can crash, but that systems can quietly convert freedom into exposure without anyone noticing. And once exposure becomes universal, there's no clean exit, only slower ones. Every cycle reaches a moment where doubt disappears, not because risks are gone, but because they've been explained away. In 1929, people didn't ignore warning signs, they reframed them. High prices weren't bubbles, they were progress. Rising debt wasn't danger, it was sophistication. Volatility wasn't instability, it was opportunity. The story changed, and once the story changes, behavior follows. People stopped asking, what if this breaks? They started asking, what if I miss out? That shift matters more than any chart. Because fear doesn't end bubbles, FOMO does. By the late stages of every major collapse, the system rewards belief and punishes caution. Those who hesitate feel left behind. Those who question feel uneducated. Those who warn feel irrelevant. This isn't accidental. Modern systems evolve to absorb criticism. When stress appears, new explanations arrive instantly. Smarter models, better data, improved safeguards, more advanced tools. The message is always the same. Yes, risks exist, but they're controlled now. In 1929, it was mass participation and modern finance. Later, it was diversification, then innovation, then technology, then speed, then scale. Different words, same function. They reduce anxiety without reducing exposure. That's how pressure keeps building without resistance, because the danger isn't ignorance, it's confidence. Once enough people believe losses are unlikely, leverage stops feeling like leverage. It feels like optimization. Risk feels priced in. Fragility feels theoretical. And systems love that moment, because confidence increases load, more borrowing, more dependency, more promises layered on top of promises. Everything works until it doesn't. Here's the uncomfortable part most people miss. By the time a system looks strong, it's usually weakest. Not because fundamentals vanish, but because tolerance disappears. When confidence is high, there's no room for surprise. No buffer for hesitation, no margin for error. Any disruption, even a small one, forces reaction. And reaction spreads faster than fear ever did. In 1929, once prices stopped rising, people didn't panic immediately. They waited. They assumed normal pullbacks. They trusted the story. That delay made things worse because systems built on continuation don't fail at the peak. They fail when momentum pauses. And the pause always feels temporary until it isn't. Now zoom out. What makes the present moment dangerous isn't instability. It's stability that depends on constant belief. Systems today don't require optimism. They require participation. Opting out feels costly. Waiting feels risky. Sitting still feels irresponsible. That's the trap. Not greed, not stupidity, not malice. Dependency. When too many outcomes rely on things continuing exactly as expected, the system loses flexibility. And without flexibility, resilience disappears. That's why collapses feel sudden. They're not sudden. They're silent until they're loud. The real warning sign isn't panic. It's comfort. It's when complexity is treated as protection. When scale is treated as safety. When history is dismissed as outdated. That's when systems stop absorbing shocks and start transmitting them. And once transmission begins, it doesn't stay contained. Because everyone built plans assuming tomorrow would look like yesterday. That assumption is the weak point, not the market, not the economy, not the asset, the belief. Here's the cruel part about economic traps. By the time people realize they're inside one, leaving feels impossible. Not because exits don't exist, but because using them feels worse than staying. In 1929, people didn't wake up one morning and panic. They waited. They held. They trusted recovery. Selling felt irresponsible. Exiting felt like admitting failure. The system trained them that way. Every large system does. It rewards participation for years, sometimes decades. It builds habits, careers, identities, entire lives around the assumption that continuation is normal. So when continuation breaks, the damage isn't just financial, it's psychological. Because leaving isn't just a decision. It's a rejection of everything that came before. That's why people stay longer than logic suggests. That's why losses compound. And that's why collapses feel unfair, even though the warning signs were visible in hindsight. The trap doesn't close with force, it closes with hesitation. At the late stage of every cycle, choices shrink. Options that once felt obvious now feel extreme. Actions that once felt prudent now feel reckless. People don't ask, what's safest? They ask, what hurts least right now? And systems exploit that instinct. Because systems don't need everyone to fail. They only need enough people to stay. Once participation remains high, pressure can keep building even as foundations weaken. The structure holds until it doesn't. And when it breaks, it doesn't break evenly. Those closest to flexibility move first. Those dependent on stability move last. That gap is where damage concentrates. This is why collapses always feel like betrayal. People did what they were told, followed incentives, trusted signals, played by the rules, and still lost. But here's the truth most narratives avoid. The system didn't lie. It just never promised safety. It promised continuity, as long as conditions held. And conditions always change. That's the part history keeps repeating. Every civilization builds systems to solve yesterday's problems. Those solutions become tomorrow's constraints. Efficiency turns into rigidity. Scale turns into fragility. Stability turns into dependence. And dependence turns into a trap. Not because people are evil, but because systems optimize for survival, not fairness. Once enough lives rely on a structure continuing, questioning it feels dangerous. Challenging it feels disruptive. Preparing for its failure feels irrational. So people wait. They wait for clarity. They wait for reassurance. They wait for normal to return. And waiting is the most expensive decision in late-stage systems, because recovery narratives arrive faster than recovery itself. There's always a reason to believe the worst has passed, until suddenly it has already happened. This is why history never looks dramatic while it's unfolding. It looks boring, confusing, manageable. The danger isn't collapse, it's normalization. When warning signs become background noise, when volatility becomes routine, when complexity becomes justification, that's when the trap is already closed. You don't hear it snap. You just notice one day that movement feels harder than before. And the scariest part? Most people won't realize what happened until years later. When someone explains it in past tense, they'll say it was obvious. They'll say the signs were there. They'll say, how did no one see it? But people did see it. They just couldn't afford to act on it. Because systems don't collapse when people rebel. They collapse when they can't hide the cost of staying anymore. And by then, the choice is no longer yours.